for you. But without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to our presenter for tonight, Claire Evans. Thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thank you for having me. Good evening, everybody. So I've opened my mouth and I'm not a Brit. Oh, well, I hope you're not devastated by this. But I can explain. So I am in Peoria, Illinois right now, but that wasn't always true. I think if you add up the time back and forth, I've had a couple stints now of living in the UK. I've been in residence there about 4 years. So how that happened in a big way, I had a little self-propelled trip, shall we say. I was a study abroad student in London. I came pre-trained though. I watched Britcoms with my mother on PBS, so I knew a lot of the lingo ahead of time, but not enough, it turned out. And well, I had to come home from study abroad. The program's over. And there I was, and I didn't know that I would necessarily meet a Brit here in Peoria and marry him. And I did not set out to do that, believe it or not. That was not my plan. But it worked out lovely. And it turned out that 6 months after we got married, the company that he was working for, and still is at the time, wanted him back to home base, which was the UK. So off we went. And that's where I had a major stint of time living there. Well, when I lived there, I needed to find some things to do because a part of the reason I married him was his sense of humor. And I have a sense of humor. He's funnier than I am, I think, but not in this case. I was working at it as a criminal prosecutor, so I'm an ex-lawyer. And he told me, the Brits can be devastating in their candor. He said, I hate to tell you, but an American prosecutor in the middle of the UK is about as useful as a chocolate teapot. And I thought, oh, true. So I had job skills that didn't exactly transfer. And it was a big recession at the time, too. So I found other ways to be occupied. One of them was British television. Oh, do I love British television? And I always have. And I love baking. However, when I tried my own version of British baking, it did not go so well. And this is the source of why I thought this was a good talk for people who are interested in the British Baking Show. Well, they call it the Great British Baking Show on PBS, but in the UK they actually call it the Bake Off, the British Bake Off, the Great British Bake Off. Well, when it transatlantics itself, it does a name change because there's actually a potential trademark issue with the Pillsbury Bake Off. So that is why, if you've ever noticed on Netflix, it might be confusing, or if you go online, it goes by a different name across the ocean. That is it. So there's a lot of translation, actually. If you want to be good at some of these recipes, or even passable, edible. Let's start the bar low, edible. There are some things you should know. Ingredients can be called all sorts of different names, and just there are some that we don't have, and that's part of what I'll talk to you about for about the first half. We'll go through lost in translation things. If you're presented with a British recipe, here's how to handle it, and here's some of the pitfalls. And then the second half of the talk, we'll tour. So I'll take you around the country and talk about some of the baked goods that are particular to a place, or some of the ones that are known by everybody just because they're that famous. So if that sounds good to you, off we go. And I always say, if you haven't eaten dinner already, you have my apologies, because there is quite a bit of cake in this particular presentation. And you're seeing one now. It's called Victoria Sponge, sometimes known as Victoria Sandwich. It is something I will tell you more about in greater detail as we go along. But before I get too far afield, I like to make sure everybody's on the same page, as they say. And for that, let's go to the map, shall we? This is the UK. The UK is shorthand for the United Kingdom of, it's kind of like four countries in one: England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. So collectively, they are the United Kingdom, the UK. So you think you speak English when you move there, and nowadays I would laugh at you because their English and our English are really fairly different, and their regional accents, oh, so many. So that's where a lot of Americans fall down, trying to understand is the fact that they can pronounce things so differently in so many ways in so many places. And then there's Welsh, and I don't didn't even try Welsh. That is very consonant heavy, spoken in Wales in addition to English, still taught in the schools, and then Scottish Gaelic. Only about 7% or something along those lines of people in Scotland speak that language in addition to English. So 63 million people overall, but 10 million of them alone live in the greater London area. So that's the cities are very population dense. And it's a smallish place, you know. When you get there as an American, sometimes you want a bit more elbow room. And that's kind of a big city thing. But once you get out of them, then yes, it gets very rolling and sheepy. It is right to call everybody British, particularly if we go back to ancient times, as in the occupation by the Romans. The big island was called Britannia. So that is the source of the word British. But if you happen to know which of these countries somebody is from individually, it might be, in some cases, a bit more deferential to call them by that nationality. And I can tell you, though, my husband is from Coventry, which is bang smack in the center of England, in the Midlands. And he would never bristle at being called British ever, nor he wouldn't. But that isn't always true because people in Scotland, for example, there is a very strong Scottish nationalist movement that would like to break away from the UK, and they haven't done it yet, but they are a vocal minority, and they would prefer to be Scottish for reasons I would direct you to Braveheart, the film, and many hundreds and thousands of years of history. So there are some pitfalls, but the other thing to know is about Irishness. Now, you can be from the island of Ireland a couple ways. You can be from ROI, that's Republic of Ireland. That is in the white part of the island, and I'll show you right there. It's on the map here. Or you can be from Northern Ireland. And if you are from Northern Ireland, you hold a UK passport. You're part of the UK, as opposed to ROI citizens, they hold an EU passport. Okay, so that's under our belt. The next question I get a lot is, well, my husband rightly pointed out, he said, when you talk about baking, you are talking about tea, aren't you? Well, tea is no joke in the UK, and they are like the yin and the yang, frankly, of baked goods. You must have your tea with your baked goods, 6 cups a day in some cases. Well, what is a decent cup of tea to a Brit? I can tell you what it isn't. It's usually not Lipton. Lipton is not strong enough. It is usually, well, I should say almost never served with the American accoutrement, that is the sides of honey or lemon. No. How they prefer to drink their strong black tea is with a splash of milk and sugar or sweetener optional. So I will tell you though, if you feel inclined to go seek out the truthful experience, here's a few brands that aren't too terribly hard to find. Here is one, Thai Fu, and you might say Gesundheit, extra strong. You might get lucky and find this occasionally at TJ Maxx. And the same could be said for another brand, Taylor's of Harrogate. Harrogate's in Yorkshire, Yorkshire tea, a very finely regarded British tea that's sufficiently strong. So that shows up from time to time at TJ Maxx too. In my local grocery store, and in Michigan, I'm pretty sure you have Meyer. They carry this too. PG Tips, England's #1 tea. That's the truth. By volume of sales, yes, it is. And it can be a little expensive compared to some of the other brands. For about 40 bags, I'm paying in my local grocery store in the international aisle about $8. So that's high. I can find as good, if not better, tea cheaper. Also, there's always, I thought this was called Twinnings for the longest time, but actually, no. When I got to the UK, they pronounce it Twinings. So that's a good brand too. And that's usually in the grocery store aisles here without too much problem. So there you have it. There's some recommendations if you wanted to check it out on your own. So with that, we'll talk about the show a bit. And we're back to tea, but more on the personnel of the show. So back when I started watching, These were the original judges, Mary Berry and Paul Hollywood. So Paul is, of course, still with us. Mary Berry has since dropped off the show, and there'll be more people coming your way. We'll talk about them in a second. So, was Mary Berry famous before she got this judging role? Oh, yes. In the UK, yes. Everybody knew who she was. She's been around forever. I believe she's in her late 80s now. She still works all the time. She's frequently in holiday specials, and she's written for many women's magazines. She has the degrees in the culinary background. So she's kind of a go-to for the BBC, the television network, on food-related stuff. So yes, she's well established. The same could not be said for Paul Hollywood. He was a new guy on the scene. Now he had good food credentials, but nobody'd really heard of him. So when they switched networks from BBC to another one called ITV, Mary went by the wayside. She said she felt such loyalty to BBC that she preferred to not migrate to a different network. So in comes a bit of a different format. They started to introduce these kind of co-hosts in addition to judges. This was before Mary's departure, but you can see here there's this is a comedy duo, and they are called Mel and Sue. That was just the name of their act. Their holding often is. So they met originally back in '93 at the Cambridge Footlights. That's a comedy troupe associated with the University, Cambridge. Were they famous in the UK before they were asked on the show? Oh, yes, they certainly were. Again, they'd been around for years. They'd been touring as comedians. They'd been on television. In fact, they hosted their own chat show. That's a talk show. So people definitely knew who they were. As an aside, the woman holding off is Sue Perkins. And if you have access to YouTube, or Netflix, or BritBox, or Acorn TV. These are some of the sources of British television shows. You might want to look up a show that she was in, also food related. As an aside, this is called The Supersizers. The Supersizers eat, and then there's a period of history stuck on. So yes, it's a reality show, and I bristle to say that, knowing that reality shows here can be not exactly critic friendly, I suppose, is one way to put it. Well, this show is very educational. It's British television. It's going to be educational, but really funny. And she's paired with a man that used to be the food critic for the Times of London, a grumpy young old man called. His name is Giles Corran. And she and they spar, and they're both very whip smart people, and they go back and forth, and the comedy is great. But their mission is to reenact in a week in a period of history, and they wear the right clothes, and they eat the right foods and drink the right drinks, and they go to a physician before and after and have blood work drawn, and they see how they fare, to see how the people's health were, to reenact these different periods. The one they did not do so well on their blood work was the French Revolution. I recall people's triglycerides went really high, and perhaps their liver values were a little off. Lots of red wine, lots of meat. But that's a funny show. And you learn quite a bit too if you're into history, food, and comedy. So I put it out there as a recommendation. So later, the show has since gone on to get new hosts. Now, this is a bit in flux. There's going to be Matt Lucas, they've announced, is going to be replaced. And to be fair, I think they have named his replacement, and the name fails me at the moment. But so far as his involvement, was he famous in the UK before they asked him on? Absolutely. And the same is true for Noel Fielding to a lesser extent. Noel Fielding's a bit more B-list, shall we say. Matt Lucas, though, had been, oh gosh, he was on a sketch comedy show called Little Britain, kind of un-PC. I can't say I watched a lot of it, but he'd been on Doctor Who. He's been on movies of all sorts. He's been on television. He hosts charitable events. So yes, people absolutely knew him. And then, so far as judging went, you see Prue Leith pop up, and her name is synonymous with a book, Leith's Cookery Bible. So in the UK, this is a popular book. In fact, I was surprised and delighted that my husband-to-be owned it. Yay. So that boded well. It's thick. When they say Bible, that's no joke. It's easily 2.5 to 3 inches on onion skin, about 6 versions of every British recipe you'd ever want. And besides the cookbook, she used to own her own cookery school. They'd call it cookery instead of cooking. So high food credentials and fairly well known in the food world. And now I'll turn my attention to some names that don't pop up in the baking show, but you probably should know about if you're interested in British baking. The Hairy Bikers. Well, is this a mistake, Claire? No, it is not. And it is what the Brits have a saying. It does what it says on the tin. It's about wood stain, but they are what they say on the tin. They're hairy and they're bikers. They actually were behind the scenes workers on BBC television, and they met up, were doing a job. They were gregarious, they love food, and they were motorbikers. And someone gave them a cooking show, but it went off beautifully. So they have gone on to lots of different series and they've written lots of books. And frankly, anything that their name is on is pretty good food. So if you see something like that cross your path recipe wise, it's not a mistake. A lot of Americans have heard of Nigella Lawson. Maybe not so much so Delia Smith. So, but these women really are like Oprah in the UK. They can go by their first name only, Nigella, Delia. Delia is a generation kind of behind Nigella. So that cookbook for Delia was from the early 90s. So she looks a bit different now. Nigella probably looks a bit different too, but she's that much younger. So they have both been on television quite a bit. Delia Smith's kind of known for no nonsense, no fuss. If it's her name's on it, it's going to be good. She uses real butter and doesn't apologize. And frankly, Nigella would too. Nigella is a bit more prominent in the media, shall we say, but she has a wonderful website, especially for Americans, nigella.com. That's it, nigella.com. And the reason I like it so much is it has a toggle button on it that lets you switch from metric measurements in these recipes of hers to cups. Oh, that is wonderful. That does a lot of work for you. So, speaking of that, let's pretend we're going to bake out of a British recipe, and I'll point out some of the pitfalls here. So this is an example. This is a recipe ingredient list for apple and blackberry crumble, I believe. And to begin, when I do any sort of baking with a British recipe that's working in grams, they're going to give me weights instead of in cups of flour or sugar. They're going to give me grams of sugar. I use a digital food scale, and the reason or the way I do it is that I zero it out. It's in grams. I place my mixing bowl on top. I zero that out. So now we start from zero, and I just add the right gram amount, and I zero it every time I change an ingredient. And then I don't have to write anything down. I can bake on the fly, which is what I want to do. So here's a few terms that differ. You see a lot of Bramley apples called for, a Bramley apple. Well, I'll tell you later a bit more detail, but all you really need to know is that it's closest to either Granny Smith's or Braeburn's for baking purposes. Demerara sugar, large crystals, light brown. It is a crunchy sort of sugar. You've seen it usually as sugar in the raw in restaurants. It's just under a different name. Castor sugar is what they call US white granulated sugar. Then there's muscovado sugar, fancy name. Here's a clue. It comes in dark and light. That's brown sugar. Porridge oats are just US rolled oats. Treacle is its own animal, but it's super close to blackstrap molasses. So you can easily substitute that. Double cream. Here come the creams. Double cream is heavy cream. Pouring cream is either light cream or sometimes even half and half. Icing sugar is powdered sugar. Sultanas are golden raisins. Essence of something is its extract. And then we come to the controversial land of suet. So suet traditionally is the fat that surrounds beef kidneys, and that's kind of fallen out of favor. So on UK store shelves nowadays, you can buy vegetarian suet. It's basically Crisco. So that arrives at the substitution. You can freeze sticks of your choice of Crisco or butter and grate them once they're frozen into the same quantity that suet's asked for, and you get much the same result. And then corn flour is cornstarch. So more on that treacle. So treacle has a cousin called golden syrup. So these are both byproducts of the sugar refining process. Treacle's very dark. Golden syrup is basically like a liquefied brown sugar. We do not have this ingredient readily available in North America. You can track it down as in international food aisles or from the Brit Emporium shops on the internet that sell to the US, but it's kind of its own animal. You can't really substitute corn syrup and expect it to taste quite the same because it's got that buttery sort of a brown sugary taste to it. Sometimes you can get it on Amazon. It's more expensive to do it that way. If you can find it in a local store in the international aisle, that's kind of the way to go. But there you have it. So if you wonder what is golden syrup, then that's the answer. I have actually a can of it right here. Traditionally, it's packaged this way, and it has been for a long time. And it's always well, I shouldn't say always. There's other brands of it, but the prominent brand is called Lyle's. Lyle's golden syrup. That's short for Tate and Lyle. Tate and Lyle is a sugar refiner, like CNH sugar is here. So they have that little lion on the can. And this label is the same label they've been using since the 1870s, and it's still made in the same plant on the banks of the River Thames in London. So quite traditional that way. A lot of steamed puddings, that is basically cakes that get steamed, use this. It holds moisture. It's really nice for creating very moist cake. So, and then sometimes if you watch the show, they'll mention tray bakes. Those are basically bar cookies. And frequently, things like anything involving oats that needs to stick together, they'll use golden syrup for too. Okay, so that's behind us now. Let's talk about flour, because flour can vary too. So plain flour is U.S. all-purpose flour. Self-raising flour, which you see quite a bit of call for, is I used to take people through the recipe of how to make it. All it is our all-purpose flour with baking powder. Well, it's baking powder in a particular proportion. King Arthur Flour makes this already done. So I can buy that at my local store. McDougall's is another brand that already makes this flour. So you can find it. And I suggest that you just buy it in the pre-measured format together. That way you don't have to worry about sifting the right amounts together. Strong flour is US bread flour, and strong refers to the amount of gluten in it. It's stretchy. And then wholemeal flour is our US whole wheat flour. When I got to the UK, they told me I had a little oven that worked on something called gas marks. And I didn't know what to do with that term, frankly. It sounded kind of rude. And I was afraid to ask for a while, but then it dawned on me we're going to need to eat. And if I'm going to have to ask somebody if I'd like to run my oven. And it turns out that UK ovens can work on either Celsius, Fahrenheit, not really anymore. They phased that out, I think, in the 60s. We're like one of 3 or 4 nations left that use Fahrenheit. And then this gas marks system. And that's just, it's a gas oven with a flame ranked 1, 2 through 9 in strength, turned up to whatever you need the heat to be. So usually you're going to find the temperature called for in Celsius. This little chart is very easily gotten online, or just plug in whatever Celsius figure they give you and it'll spit out a Fahrenheit. So that's pretty easy to convert. Old recipes get very unspecific. They say that please place it in a moderate oven. And you think, well, what is that? Again, you can find these online. Liquids. This is our last stop on equivalencies. So a dessert spoon of something, which you might see, is about a teaspoon. You might get lucky and see an old recipe that uses cups. Most of them are going to ask for things in either ounces, liquid ounces, or milliliters. Milliliters is usually how it is nowadays. And that's usually okay with Americans because our Pyrex just flip it around. And then the markings on the back are the milliliter equivalents. Well, here's something to know. If a recipe calls for a pint of liquid, it's not a US pint. There's a difference. There is a UK pint, and that is something else. So a US pint is 16 liquid ounces. However, a UK pint is 19.2. So this is a true UK pint glass. This is what they would call an imperial pint. And you can see it's kind of dishwashered away. Pint to line. There it is, pint to line. There's the crown right there. Yeah, there we go. And then half pint. So you wouldn't want to put 16 ounces in an imperial pint recipe because that will short it by 3.2 ounces. Anyway, just so you know, I've done that before, even amongst many other mistakes. So my loss is your future gain. So back to the show. The last thing I'll tell you, and I'll show you at the end too, is that I'd mentioned briefly a lot of UK puddings, that is desserts, can be steamed. How do they steam them? In what they call a pudding basin. I have one, but you don't have to have one. Basically, a little glass Pyrex bowl will perfectly do as well. So it's something to know, and I'll just show you how we do it at the end because it's kind of clunky to unfurl until I'm ready to put it down and crash it if I have to get off suddenly. That doesn't happen much. The cats aren't around. So, well, let's tour. We begin in northern England, in the northwest particularly. This is called the Lake District, very scenic. The lake you're seeing is Lake Windermere, and it holds claim to being the home of a very famous British pudding called sticky toffee pudding. Sticky, oh yes, referring to toffee sauce. That's caramel sauce on a very rich, moist, dark cake. And the caramel sauce is baked on the top or it's poured over it and it kind of infuses the cake. It's almost, I think it's always served warm. I've never had it cold. Oh, yes, it's very delicious. But a little bit of tourism as we're here. It's probably arguably most famous resident was Beatrix Potter. So she was a Londoner by birth, but after she became famous and rich in her lifetime, well, that's rare, especially because she's single. So she's a single female who's famous and wealthy. And that why is that so rare? Well, it had been the English rule that when you marry as a female, any assets you have transfer to your husband on marriage. She was not. So she has total rights to dispose of her income how she chooses, and she starts buying property in the Lake District. So her first acquisition was something called Hilltop Cottage. You can go visit this. It's part of a big list of properties managed by the National Trust, and it is a land trust. I believe it's in the, if it might be six, it's definitely 1 to 10 top landholders in all of the UK. And they have this massive catalog of places that they professionally manage of historic significance generally, or cultural significance in her case. And you can pay a fee and go in and see it. It's accessible to the public. Or here's the travel tip. You can pay a fee in the US and join the National Trust. It's a year's membership, and they'll send you a card and a catalog. And that way, if you want to see more than one of the properties they manage, and there's so many, all you do is you show the card when you go over, and you don't have to pay admission. You've paid your dues for the year, and it's far cheaper to do it that way than if you were to pay individually at places. So back on Beatrix, she really got inspired by the creatures that were lurking at Hilltop Cottage, rats, namely. And they showed up again in the sequel to The Tale of Tom Kitten. The tale of the jam roly-poly. And a jam roly-poly, by the way, is a very traditional British dessert. That is basically a Swiss roll, like a spiral pinwheel of sponge cake, and not like the Pepperidge Farm memory foam cake. Just a nice yellow cake, usually made from scratch, that they roll up with jam in the middle into pinwheel form and slice. Lots of school kids have had this with their lunches over the years there. So she got inspired by these creatures and she started to put them into her books. And on her death, she gave away her property to the National Trust. So you can go see Hilltop Cottage because National Trust manages it and it's beautiful. So back on the pudding, and what is it? So it's this hugely moist cake. You can either steam it, you can bake it. The legends of how it came to the Lake District are various. It's either New Zealanders or Australian ailermen, kind of unclear there, that brought it. And it's kind of a modern classic. All the pubs seem to have it on their menus. It's right up there with that jam roly-poly. And these are other classic British desserts, bread and butter pudding, and a fun word, spotted dick. That is a sponge cake that's usually steamed and it's got tiny little currants, dried currants in it. Those are the spots. I've heard of a little girl served that at school that called it fly cemetery. So it tastes better than a fly cemetery for sure. So this rich toffee, this the toffee is kind of their synonymous word with caramel in American. This sauce gets famous. In fact, this company called Cartmel, the home of sticky toffee pudding, that's a commercially made sticky toffee pudding from the Lake District that you can buy at a particular food store. It's your grocery store chain called Waitrose. And they started off as a little post office and village shop in this town, Cartmel, in the Lake District. And they catered to picnickers and hikers that were going into the scenery. And they'd sell little portions of things, one of which was sticky toffee pudding. And they got so famous and it was so good, they expanded their operation and now they're national. And I even think they ship it. But I would tell people this is super easy to make. Mary Berry's sticky toffee pudding, her recipe is in the recipe packet. And I understand it was emailed out before the presentation. Well, here's the unfun part for me, disclosure. Oh, well, thank goodness I am a former lawyer. It's rocket fuel. I'll just cut to the chase. One serving, a very generous one at that, though, is 927 calories and 88 grams of carbs. Oh boy, 59 grams of fat. So, what is the point of this, you say? Why are you telling me? Don't have this the evening before your fasting lipid profile or your fasting blood sugar. No, no. So you know what you're in for. I rarely eat it. And when I do, I definitely enjoy it. And you can't eat very much of it, I find. It's very sweet, actually, abnormally sweet for British desserts. Usually they skew less sugar. This is an exception. Well, let's think healthier thoughts and go into blackberry and apple crumble. Now, so that isn't a particular place tied to this, it's an everywhere sort of dish. So, more on that Bramley apple. It's really popular. You find that recipes call for it frequently. And it's even in, we used to eat Tesco as a big grocery store chain, Bramley apple sausages that they made. Oh, they're so good. Why do they like it? Well, for cooking, it gets nice. It's tart. It's fluffy when it cooks. It doesn't disintegrate. So that's why it's an equivalent to a Granny Smith or a Brayburn. If you were a true purist and you wanted to seek this out in the US, it's called Bramley seedling and it qualifies as an heirloom species of apple. So it's around. I've never tried this, but apparently you could. I've just substituted when I needed to. So, just as a little aside, there is a county called Kent, which is to the southeast of London. That's in the southeast of the country generally. And Kent is on the ocean. So the Thames River snakes all through London. Ultimately, if you follow it to the east, the south side of that will be Kent, and it's there, right? There is the ocean. They have a microclimate and they grow a lot of fruit there. They grow a lot of strawberries in particular that get shipped up on the trains during Wimbledon. The traditional dessert to eat while you watch Wimbledon as a live spectator is strawberries and cream. So I did that. Delicious. So they have microclimates all over, but they can grow blackberries just everywhere. They're indigenous anymore. So they've been in the UK 8,000 years, and their season is traditionally about August to October. But there is a legend, shall we say, in the Church of England that the berries are not supposed to be picked after a church holiday called Michaelmas, which is on the 29th of September. And if you do, the devil is said to have either spit or stamped or done worse to the berries, rendering them not consumable. Well, I am a fruitarian. I've loved fruit for forever, and I've eaten them after Michaelmas, and I am here to talk to you tonight. So people forage them widely and freely because they're all over the UK. We had our favorite spots, and as long as they're on public property, and there's a lot of public property in the UK, walking paths, bridle paths, all that's fair game. So you take your Tupperware and your Ziplocs and you go in your season and you fill your bags and containers with these huge berries and you freeze them. And that way you can have your apple and blackberry crumble all winter. And they coincide in season with apples. So that was likely the reason that they were put together in a crumble. Well, as a topper for that and many other things, the Brits like custard. And it's not ever frozen custard. That's an American thing. This is hot egg custard, which you can make fairly easily enough out of egg yolks or heavy cream and sugar if you want it. Or you can do what the Brits do. And most of them are using, I wouldn't even say instant custard. It's certainly a shortcut powder. Well, story. This is Bird's custard powder. There's other brands. Bird's is usually the dominant one. It goes over everything: cakes, pies, what have you. Whatever you want to put it on is acceptable in the UK. You can find it on Amazon. Again, you'll probably pay more there. I can find it in my local Kroger grocery store, usually on drastic clearance because people don't know what it is. So I have a custard story, and hopefully it saves you some turmoil. So here it is, Bird's custard. So back many years ago, I had not yet married my Brit then boyfriend, if not fiance. I don't recall, but he decided to have a dinner party of expat Brits here in Peoria when we had met fairly recently. And they decided that they'd like something for dessert with custard because they hadn't had it in a long time. And then someone muttered, "But in my family, men make the custard." And that got my attention. So, of course, as a matter of right, I said, "I will make it. I can read, I cook." So I did. And there are the directions right there on the back. How hard could this be? I can make macaroni and cheese. Yeah. So I read and I followed them. I was particularly smitten by this set of directions here that says microwave. Microwave. I thought, oh, wow, a few easy steps. Let's try the microwave method. So I followed it. Nothing. Didn't set up. Put on more time. Didn't set up. Put in more powder. Didn't set up. Again, rinse and repeat the cycle. Ultimately, I go back to the microwave. What is supposed to be light yellow is now self-tan or orange. And worse, a fork will stick into it, lift it completely out of the Pyrex, and we can cut it and have it in pieces. I had to confess to the diners. Most of them went like this. One said something about his precious custard powder. Well, what I should have done is follow the next set of directions. It says there, on the hob. On the hob. The hob is the stovetop in the UK. You need to control the heat. This uses milk and a heavy saucepan. If you can't control the heat, it'll scorch or it'll set up in a really funny way that you don't want. And then you'll have to eat it as a solid, not a liquid. So I tell you my tale of woe so that I can save you from a fate worse than chewy custard. All right. Well, back to the show. So we've probably exhausted that topic. It feels exhausting even all these years later. Let's go to a different location. Let's go to York. So York is a major city in Yorkshire. Go figure. Not Yorkshire. Americans like to put the Shire on the end of things, like the Shire in The Hobbit, which is odd because you'd think it's the Shire based on that, or Hillshire Farm sausage, also a no. Usually it's pronounced sure on the end, or regionally it can vary, but that's usually getting you much closer. So York, the city, cities contain a cathedral by definition. This is a very famous one, York Minster. All of this is about 2 hours north of London on a very direct train. So not only do they have York Minster, the famous cathedral, they have a lot of Roman ruins right under the cathedral. It's built on top of a Roman fort. Then, after the Romans took off, there was some Anglo-Saxons in the middle, and here then come the Vikings. So they have something called Jorvik Viking Center. Jorvik is the Viking term Norse for York, what became York. And these gardens of theirs, which is where you find the Roman sarcophagi delightfully turned into planters in a very English way. Because do you want to haul a 2,000-pound, basically empty pot nowadays into somewhere else? No, they plant it up with tulips and call it done. They have great history, so they have great ghost walks. They have a street called the Shambles. And if you've heard that term as referring to something's a real mess, it's a shambles. That actually refers to what a shambles in Middle English used to be. It was a meat market. And that was okay in the morning when there wasn't refrigeration, yet the day was young. But as the sun went over and the meats are outdoors aging, it became a real shambles. So now you know. There's something there called Yorkshire pudding. Well, Yorkshire puddings are everywhere. Well, is a rule breaker. So a Yorkshire pudding is not a dessert. It's actually a bread item. More on that in a moment. And then they used to have a chocolate bar called a Yorkie bar, and their slogan was, "It's not for girls." Well, did I pay attention to that? I think not. So one of the things food-wise they're known for particularly is rhubarb. In fact, this area called the rhubarb triangle sometimes gets nicknamed the Tusky Triangle. So rhubarb comes from Siberia originally, and it's quite easy to grow in this part of the world. It kind of has it acclimated for some reason. It likes it there, and they force it in sheds. So they're trying to not have the leaf develop green. They'd like to grow it in the dark. And it grows so fast that they allege you can hear it growing. If you are super bored of watching your paint dry, you can go on Wikipedia and if you put in Tusky Triangle, then they have a little sound file there you can play that alleges to be the sound of rhubarb growing. Well, at one point in time, this part of the world produced 90% of the world's forced winter rhubarb. So this is their big crop. As an aside, also, have a look at this picture, bearing in mind what we just talked about. This is a garden in the extreme southwest of England in a county called Cornwall. And it looks like a claw that juts out into the North Atlantic, the very, very tip, Land's End. So there are these subtropical gardens there. And there in particular, in the back, is a very dark plant. This. Any ideas of what this might be? Do I have any gardeners with us this evening? If you look at the shape of the leaf, does it remind you of anything? Hint, we just talked about something that might be pertinent. I can tell you from past guessers that have rightly guessed geraniums. No, it's not. In fact, if you have a peek at the bottom of the picture, the lady in blue, she fits under these leaves. She could easily wander into this forest. So, is anybody brave enough to go with what you think this might be? Any guesses? You could put it in the chat if you liked. I'll give you a second. This is where I need the Jeopardy thing. And I've always had a mental note to get it, but I don't. And I can't sing it. So, oh no, no one is brave. Not tonight. I have no idea, but those are huge. So says Mercedes at the library. And she's right. They are huge. I'll tell you, those stems are up to 10 foot tall. And the leaves overhead are between 4 and 5 feet across. And the answer you've been pining for is giant rhubarb. This is giant rhubarb. And it's grown largely, it's decorative. It's completely unedible, which is a downer if you're into fruit like me. But the other thing of it is impossible to go harvest this even if you wanted to, because the stems are super spiky. It is really perilous in there. It's not like Alice in Wonderland, then the rhubarb drank or ate something. No, but it's super interesting. And it was something that the Victorian plant collectors brought over, and then they realized this is showy, let's grow giant rhubarb. But botanically, it's not really that closely related. They just call it giant rhubarb. Okay, well, if we're eating rhubarb, here's where to look. Gin, drinking it, rhubarb and custard sweets, those are hard candies. Yogurt in season. They tend to do it all this in season. And tea. Taylor's of Harrogate makes fruit tea out of rhubarb. Oh, is it delicious? Those 2 bell jars you see out of clay, those are for forcing rhubarb. We were gifted one. Illinois' climate is way too hot to force rhubarb, so I say no to that. But if in case you wondered how do you force rhubarb, you do it under those sorts of jars or in sheds. So here's the Yorkshire pudding story. So these are basically bread rolls. They're little puffy pancake-like items. If you go to York in a pub and you order yourself a roast dinner, they might serve it to you in a Yorkshire the size of your dinner plate. And if you're a carb lover, this is delightful. If you're not, though, they make mini Yorkshires, and those fit into the muffin tins. You can even buy those everywhere in the freezer case. They're very popular to have with roast dinners. So the key to making them, if you'd like to make them on your own, they're not super hard. You have to have cold batter from the fridge that goes into a preheated tin with really hot oil in it. And that thermal shock from hot into cold is what gives you the puff. And then you kind of knock back the heat once it's set. So and you can't peek. That's the other thing. You can't open the oven door or else you risk deflating them. But speaking of deflated, here's one. This is a variant of Yorkshire puddings called Toad in the Hole. Fun. So what's that? Toe in the hole are grilled sausages that they've put into a Yorkshire pudding batter and baked. And frankly, when I do mine, it's a lot more puffy. Onion gravy optional. Well, we'll move on in our touring. And I like to give people my short list of castles near London or in near. When people visit to the UK for the first time, generally London seems to factor heavy into their touring. Well, and rightly so. There's a lot to see, but outside the city is wonderful too. There's all sorts, but here are the highlights. The picture you see is Hampton Court Palace, most famously home of King Henry VIII. You can drive there on a tour, or you can get the boat. So, in the good weather, from central London, the Thames flows down to Hampton Court. I'll show you on the map in a second, and you can take a ferry there. It's a really great trip. Talk about no traffic and so relaxing. Windsor, which we've known as the Queen's, one of her favorite places, that's out by Heathrow. So if you have time to spend overnight, I suggest people stay in Windsor as opposed to at the airport because they're only 10 minutes away from the airport and it's a lot more scenic and interesting. Then there's the Tower of London. That's in central London. That's the very old part of London, and actually the city of London called Londinium in Roman times. And then Kensington Palace is still in central London, not so old. That is home, it was home to Diana and William and Catherine, depending on where they're living at the moment. So here's a map of all those places. And I'll kind of show you our guide is the Thames. So this is the River Thames. Let's start here. It snakes, absolutely. So here's City of London, Londinium, the old part. That's a financial district nowadays. And there's the tower, built by William the Conqueror after the Norman Conquest, 1066, big date in British history. That was the first and only, well, not the first, but the last successful invasion of England. So we'll snake through on the river. Then we're getting into more kind of central modern London and up in the northwest corner of Hyde Park. That's where you find Kensington Palace. It's off the river there. We'll get back onto the river and we'll wind and you'll see to Windsor and Heathrow. So Heathrow is so far out, it's off the map. I think 30 miles, something like that. And then farther down the river, we pass a town called Richmond. That might become important in a moment. And finally, we'll get to Hampton Court, and that's how you get to the palace on the water. Well, one of those castles or places had a baked good associated with it, and that would be Hampton Court and Richmond Maids of Honor. So these are little cheese tarts. And the legend goes that King Henry VIII, who based on his later portraiture didn't really turn down many snacks, approached a group of maids of honor to his first wife, his first queen, Catherine of Aragon. She kept her head. And they were eating these little tarts. He asked to try one. He deemed them so delicious that he put the recipe in a lockbox where it remained for the next 200 years until a pastry shop in Richmond unearthed it and got the secret recipe. Do you believe that? Don't know, but they're really good. Next, Cornwall. So I told you this is the farthest southwest county. There's the map of the UK, and very much at the very tip, here is Cornwall lit up in red, and that this looks literally like a claw, an arm with a claw, clawing out into the ocean. So the baked good they're known for, very famously, is called a Cornish pasty. Note the short A, pasty. What is it? It's a meat turnover. The traditional ones are made with steak and potatoes, onions, salt and pepper, something called swede. We call it rutabaga. It's just under a different name. And they crimp it into this basically very large turnover with a really good crimp crust on the edge. And how these were particularly made and used to begin with, Cornwall has been known for mining for millennia. And the picture that you see is of a Cornish mine house. So that's a granite structure that at one point in its history would have held a water pump, a steam engine that pumped water from out underneath, in this case, the seabed. The mines went so deep. They're mining tin and copper, among other things. And they have to keep these pumps on all the time so they don't flood. Well, they also have arsenic in what they're mining. That's not so good. So the miners would take these for their lunch or dinner breaks and they would eat the center, holding it by the crimp. But then when they were done, they would toss that crimp over their shoulder and not eat the pastry. I would think, what a waste. But they had arsenic on their hands and they didn't want anything they just touched to go in their mouth. Surely they found that out the hard way. So, moving on, different part of the country. When we were living in the UK, how could we not visit a place called Bakewell? Well, that's truth in advertising. And it's happily near a very lovely national park, the Peak District National Park. So, what are we after? My husband's all-time favorite British dessert is Bakewell tart. So, a homemade one looks like the lower left. It is a what they call it a sweet crust pastry with a layer of raspberry jam, a cake made of almonds called frangipan, and then icing sugar on the top and a few almond sprinkles. Very, very good. They're also known for something called Bakewell pudding. Well, I had that. And in fact, I thought I'd get a good one. I went to the old original Bakewell pudding shop. We both did. And I had that, which turned out to be a massive egg custard in a pastry shell, like a puff pastry. My husband got the better deal. And I did not dare to take more than a bite, although I could have happily eaten his and left mine. So, editorial review. If you buy Bakewell tarts in the stores, they look like the far right, those miniature little pies. And they've got the icing and the cherry usually is on top. And they're usually made by a company called Mr. Kipling. And I say that's Little Debbie's British uncle. They're found all over in stores in the UK by that brand, Mr. Kipling. Well, here's more on the Victoria sponge or sandwich. So, indeed, Victoria is referring to Queen Victoria. It was a tea time treat popular in her reign. It's two layers of sponge cake. In the middle is the buttercream. They don't slather the outsides like the Americans do, and they layer that buttercream then with jam. Usually, most traditionally strawberry, raspberry. You can do whatever you like, and then they just dust it with icing sugar and call it done. My favorite quote I've ever found about it, it says, "You will encounter a Victoria sponge in most tea rooms in England. It will be a friendly encounter." Oh, yes. If they didn't have decent Victoria sponge, any tea room would go out of business pretty shortly by popular demand. And there's riffs on this. In the recipe packet, there's Nigella's birthday custard sponge, incorporating my old nemesis bird's custard powder into the buttercream layer. And it makes it kind of nicely custardy icing flavor. And then milk chocolate ganache on top. And these tiny, what we'd call nonpareils in the US, they call hundreds and thousands. And I think that's a far better name because my picture that I made of it is there in the corner. That's exactly how many were on my floor after I finished that, but it tastes good. Then Christmas pudding. Is it particular to a place? No, it's all over the UK, also known as figgy pudding, always steamed. This is a steamed pudding. You make it a months and months ahead. You can go into October to make it. And because it's steamed so long, it turns practically black. That's all crystal, that's sugar that's being caramelized. They want it to sit in a cool, dark place for a while so the flavor will blend. Sometimes they'll flame it with brandy or brandy butter, custard again, ice cream, clotted cream. That's coming up in a second. So lots of different ways to serve it, but around the holidays. Then there's scones or scones, depending on where you're from. They can be of all sorts of varieties, plain, fruited, savory. I find the best ones I've had are from the National Trust tea rooms, and there's a lot of them at the properties they manage. They have a recipe in the packet too. And then, if you're particularly in the southwest of England, then clotted cream is your friend. Oh, what is this? It's in the long list of different creams. Clotted cream sounds vile, but it's actually incredibly delicious. All it is heavy whipping cream that isn't ultra pasteurized. It can't be UHT, ultra high treatment, heat treatment, because that ruins the reaction that you need. You need to coddle it over low heat. And that long heat process separates out this cream. The top layer becomes this really velvety, smooth, kind of the texture of soft cream cheese, none of the tang. Tastes like sweet whipped cream with a crunchy sugar crust. That is the lactose on top. It's extremely good. It's very high wattage. people put it on their scones with jam. And if they have a tea with it, a cup of tea, that's known as a cream tea. So you can make this. You can make it at home, and it's really easy to do if you have an instant pot with a yogurt setting. I tried this; it works. The way to find this particular type of cream you need, non-ultra heat pasteurized or non-ultra pasteurized, is find these couple brands. Nationally, there's one called Organic Valley, and that pops up at Whole Food stores, sort of places, kind of organic places that would carry products that aren't super treated. So I'm afraid it won't work unless you get non-ultra pasteurized cream. But when you do, you will be rewarded. It is absolutely just like the real thing they make down in Cornwall. So I have to stop somewhere. So here is a good place. I will tell you if you think of anything after the fact, or you get into the recipe packet and you have any questions, by all means, you can use my website to find me. It's called Tea with Claire. Go figure. TEA with CLAIRE.com. So there's my way to contact me via email there. There's also a link to my Facebook page. I find all sorts of good recipes that I put up, or just interesting stories about the various Brit topics that I talk about, or just I find quirky. And fun, this year I have a book out. Wahoo! It comes out in late August. It will be on pre sale next month. It's my memoir of the years I spent living in the UK. It's a feel good book, not a weepy that you don't want to read at night. It's called High Tea and the Lowdown: An American's Unfiltered Life in the UK. So if you are at all interested in that, you can get more details on my website. You can read an excerpt via my website. Try before you buy it. And as I said, the pre-order will be on sometime coming up soon and then available in late August. All right. Well, with that, I will come back to you and I'll see if anybody might have had any questions as we went along. As far as the township library is concerned, I don't mind if people want to unmute themselves. We have a small enough group to do that. Or if you want to type anything in the chat, we're happy to read, or I am, the royal we. I'm happy to read those too.
Yeah, definitely feel free to ask any questions. I definitely got really hungry during this presentation.
Sorry, dinner hour is a rough one for this
Mm-hmm.
one, but
Yes, I will
I will.
definitely have to try something. I'm glad that you sent us the recipe packet.
Do you know where to start? This is a good answer to a question I get frequently. Where do I begin?
Yes, that would be
Here,
my question. Where the heck do I start?
sticky toffee pudding is super easy.
Yeah.
Now, knowing that, you might increase your girth doing it,
Mm,
but
yeah.
you make it and you take it to work and you make
Mm,
friends. And
yes.
it's super delicious. I've served it at libraries before. It goes
Oh,
down very easily and well,
yeah.
usually by the shot glass, it seems. So, and I forgot, I promised I'd show you my steamer. How do you steam a pudding? So, pretend this is a Pyrex. This is my actual pudding basin. Mine is quirky, so mine's hollow, and that's so the water can get through it and it'll go faster. But
Oh.
fast is not your friend for Christmas pudding. My husband does the Christmas pudding. I've been banned. Uh,
Oh no.
well, he knows what he's doing, and we get into
Hmm.
arguments over measurements. He's an engineer.
Oh.
And he's so imprecise.
Yeah.
I want to measure everything and weigh it, and he just throws it in there. And I just say, you know what? You win with the cultural card. You can do it, and he will. And he steams it overnight for 8 hours. So that's not your beginner recipe. That's
Right.
serious. That's hardcore if you want the good
Yeah.
experience. But so how to do it? My lid comes off like ceramic. All you need is it's grease. So this is cake batter. It's going to go in here basically. And it gets greased like a cake tin would. You grease the middle, you grease whatever's going to go on top, usually wax paper. You grease that and then put a layer of tin foil over it. And then you tie it with twine like a Christmas package.
Mm.
And then you this says, put the bow on the side. I say no. I move the bow from here to here to avoid the burn department, because you're going to use the bow to pick it up like a handle. And the water only gets filled to here. So you don't boil it. This is just a
Right.
simmer, right? And I like this because it's dummy proof. When steaming, water bath line to this level. I just picture a nice British woman telling me that. And although I didn't like my nice Garmin telling me things when I lived there, that's another story. Someone asked a question as I was blathering on, and it was, oh, Amy says, what do you miss most about England? Hmm, I'm thinking. I think, well, it isn't the weather. Let's start by what don't I miss? There are lovely days in spring, but winter is rough because it doesn't really, there's no sun, very, very little sun. Um, I like the touring and the history. The stately homes, they call them. That's a phrase, stately homes. That's an aristocratic mansion. And a lot, the national trusts have tons open. You can go see. You can be your historic tourist every weekend for your life, and you will never run out of things to see and do. And the age of things that to Americans, it seems like, my dad's car was an antique and it was in the 60s. Oh, no, no, no. That's youthful by their definition. I would go out for drinks sometimes in a town with a pub of the 1400s era, in which case you have to watch your head because they were shorter then. And they have signs up that says duck or grouse because they've had people concuss themselves. So it's quirky things like that. Those are fun. Stuff you can't find here in the US.
Right.
All right. Well, I don't see any further. I hope you intrepid bakers might try something in the recipe packet. And Victoria sponge is another good one to start with. That's pretty easy.
If
So
anyone tries anything, you can put it on Facebook and tag the library and tag Claire.
tag
We would
me.
love to
Yes.
see if you try anything out.
Or I will own up to a disaster. That woman told me to try this, and it didn't turn out. And that's okay because heavens knows I've had foibles too. I told you about a lot of them, so it happens. No judgment, no judgment.
Yes. If anyone else has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat now. Otherwise, thank you so much for coming tonight.